Hello and welcome back. It is Sunday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm continuing my talk about Virgil's Aeneid. And so this week we're going to be talking about the first half of the poem, sort of ending with his trip into Hades and everything that comes before that. So let's dive into it. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. So while there's other adventures that Aeneas and his crew faces on their journey back to Italy, the one that sort of sticks in people's minds a lot is the tempestuous relationship between Dido and Aeneas. And so the one question that we kind of find ourselves asking is sort of what does this serve, or what purpose does this serve the narrative overall? Because the purpose of the story is to show how Aeneas made it to Italy and founded what would later become Rome. And it's also kind of setting up sort of Roman history as sort of a preordained thing that the gods were involved with. And we get this lengthy sort of sidebar where Aeneas, he goes to Carthage, he gets blown off course by Juno, and he has this kind of relationship with Dido, and things don't go well. And so if you look at the grand scheme of things, it should feel like just kind of a side quest. It's like if you look at the Odyssey and you ask yourself, what purpose does his time on Calypso's island serve? Because he stays with Calypso for 7 years, he's unable to escape, and he's really not really able to say no. Now, he does eventually kind of go to her willingly. They do have kind of a semi-consensual relationship, but he is there against his will, so he doesn't have a lot of choice. So it's a lot more complex than it's simply just being all that, but I don't want to get into that yet. But the purpose of Odysseus being on Calypso's island is literally just to fill up time. All it does is it keeps Odysseus away so that the situation in Ithaca can get worse, basically. And that's kind of all it does. It doesn't do anything in terms of character arcs or the overall purpose of the thing. It's just a roadblock to keep Odysseus from coming home, to allow for other things to happen in Ithaca, so that when he does get home, it's a pretty big problem that he has to fix. With the Aeneid, though, the things in Carthage are very important, and they serve kind of a multifaceted purpose in the overall story, so we'll get into that. But I wanted to do kind of a rundown of what the relationship between Dido and Aeneas is, because that will sort of give you an idea of sort of what we're going for. Okay, so Aeneas arrives in Carthage due to the influence of Juno. She bribes Aeolus, who controls the winds, and bribes him and forces him to sort of blow Aeneas and the other Trojans off course so that they land in Carthage. Carthage is a country kind of in northern Africa. And so you've got northern Africa here, and then you've got Italy up here, and Greece is over here. And so they come this way, but instead of going up to Italy, they end up going down to Africa. When they arrive, he meets Dido, who's the queen of Carthage, and tells her the story of the last days of Troy, his escape from Troy, and everything that kind of happened on his journey. That's sort of the Odyssey section, because we get things like he meets Harpies, he passes by Scylla and Charybdis, he even kind of does a drive-by of Circe's island. We see him kind of pass by Ithaca fairly early to kind of show just how easy it was to get from Troy to Ithaca if Odysseus' men hadn't ruined everything and blown them way off course. And so like he tells of the voyage and kind of all that fun stuff, but it's very clear that the voyage is just sort of a means to establish his credentials as a hero. And Dido really likes the story that he tells. Now, she lost her husband a few years back, and she's had other suitors, but she's never really been interested in another relationship. But when she hears Aeneas tell his story, she's really smitten with him right away. And now she knows at this point that he does, like, his journey is taking him to Italy, because that's where he's going, because the gods have kind of preordained that he's going to found a settlement which will later become Rome. And so she's aware of this, but she really falls for him hardcore. Now, Dido's sister, Anna, she sort of convinces Dido. She says, like, I know they're supposed to leave, but, Carthage is kind of in a tenuous political place at that point, and having the Trojans there would really strengthen their kind of legitimacy, because it would give them basically, like, it would add to their army in an important way. And so, her sister is kind of like, it wouldn't be the worst thing if they stay here. And she kind of asked Dido to kind of find a way to sort of keep the Trojans there for as long as they can, because, this would be good. And Juno, the queen of the gods, is sort of on their side on this, because she doesn't want Aeneas to succeed in his quest. And a bit of a sidebar about Juno, she sort of just functions in this story as the godlike antagonist that sort of makes Aeneas's accomplishments that much more impressive, because it's like, Odysseus was facing up against Poseidon, and the Trojans in the Iliad were facing out against they were facing against Hera and Apollo, who were both defending the Trojans, and also Aphrodite as well. And so now we've got Juno is sort of the villain of the story. But once we get to Rome itself, Juno was kind of a supporter of Rome, and she was in charge of marriage and the queen of the gods, and her support was Rome. But at this point, this is kind of before Rome, we needed a godlike antagonist, so that it isn't just Aeneas facing sort of mundane issues, he's facing like divine retribution. And so at this point, Juno is very angry at the Trojans. She's still mad about the judgment of Paris, where in her Greek counterpart, Hera, so Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite were there was a beauty contest, and they were sort of asked to strip themselves nude so that Paris could choose the most beautiful one, and it was very humiliating for her. And there's other things. She's still angry about the fall of Troy. There's just a long list of grievances that Juno has. And so she comes around eventually to the Romans, and she is supportive of them. But at this point, Juno is sort of still kind of a chaotic element in the story. She really supports Carthage. That's kind of a city that she loves. And she doesn't want Rome to be founded yet. But she comes around later. But at this point, Juno is sort of trying to find ways to keep Aeneas from reaching Italy. And so she tells Venus, who's the Roman counterpart to Aphrodite. And like I mentioned last time, Venus existed before she was kind of mapped onto Aphrodite's story. So Venus was probably a mother goddess. She had sort of different sources and was a combination of maybe a couple different goddesses. But Venus existed first. And then once the Romans sort of met with the Greeks and borrowed sort of elements of their mythology, basically Aphrodite's purpose and her sort of relationship to the other gods was sort of mapped onto Venus. And so Venus sort of became the Aphrodite god for all intents and purposes. So Venus is the goddess of love. She functions a little bit differently, because if you read Aphrodite in the Iliad, she's a little bit more flighty. She isn't really concerned about any end goals. She just wants people to be in love. And so, she protects Paris, she protects Aeneas because he's her son. And in this one, we've got Venus, who's a lot more savvy, because Venus sort of knows what Aeneas's destiny is. So Venus is Aeneas's mother, and she knows what his destiny is and where he's supposed to go. And so when Juno tells her about her plan to sort of get Aeneas and Dido together, she thinks that, it's like, well, this is your purview, because she thinks you're the goddess of love, and so this would be something that you would be interested in. And Venus sort of gives her a non-committal answer. She sort of knows that Juno is plotting something, and so she's like, oh yeah, sure, that's a great thing they could do, because Venus knows that even though she would normally support a relationship between two people that are in love, she knows that Aeneas has a duty to do. So Juno arranges a storm that sort of forces Aeneas and Dido to take shelter in a cave. And so, of course, like any fan fiction ever, whenever you have two people who are forced to share a cave together and they both sort of find each other attractive, they end up having sex. And Dido sees this as a marriage, you know, and I think Aeneas at the time, he says, "Oh yeah, sure, this is a marriage. We're married." Aeneas is a very sneaky guy, and he has a tendency to say one thing in the moment and then later be like, "Oh, I never said that. You must be mistaken," you know. Typical guy. So at this point, Juno sends the goddess Rumor around and starts spreading the knowledge that Aeneas and Dido have hooked up. And what she's intending to do at this point is to stir up animosity towards Aeneas, because everyone starts seeing him as kind of an equivalent of like Paris, you know, come to steal Helen of Troy away. And it's a very tenuous political situation, and so there's other factions involved and other rulers, and it makes Dido's kingdom look not very strong. And so there's another king, Iarbas, who is actually a son of Jupiter himself, via a nymph, an African nymph is what the poem says. And he sort of prays to Jupiter and says, you know, this can't happen. This is going to disrupt everything. You know, we can't allow this to happen. And Jupiter is like, why is Aeneas staying there? What is the point of this? He has a duty to do. And so Jupiter sends Mercury. Mercury is sort of the Roman equivalent of Hermes, who's like a messenger and trickster-ish god and everything. And Mercury goes down and says, hey, look, Aeneas, you have to leave. You have a duty to do. You cannot stay here. And at this point, Aeneas he's kind of fallen in love with Dido. He's helping her fortify the walls. He's helping her with like city planning. Like he's kind of basically acting like they are married and they are together, and he does sort of love her. But Mercury is really, really rough. Like, this isn't some, you know, hey, if you want, it would be great if you could leave. This is like, no, you need to leave. You have a duty to do. And, you know, what are you doing here? This is not good. And so Aeneas is now stuck in this sort of impossible decision between his duty and the woman he loves. And he makes a decision in favor of his duty because he's a good Roman, even though Rome doesn't exist yet. That's the whole point of this poem. And so he considers telling Dido about this and trying to convince her that this is the best thing to do, but ultimately he decides, you know, maybe I should just leave and not say anything. Everyone's met guys like this. But so again, Juno sends Rumor to tell Dido about this, and Dido flies into this like insane rage. She rages through the city, and just like this, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, literally. And she confronts Aeneas and she calls him a traitor and says, how could you do this to me? And, you know, just everything. Her speech is amazing. If your version of Dido is sort of the version that we see in like Henry Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas, where she's more of a tragic romantic figure, this is not that version. Although if you do want to listen to the opera, I actually listened to the whole thing while I was writing up my notes for today's video, and it's fantastic. It's pretty short. It's about like an hour long, and the finale is this aria that she sings right before the end, Dido's Lament, which is just heartbreaking and wonderful. And also, this is an English language opera. Henry Purcell was English, and so you don't have to deal with like translating what they're saying. They're singing in English and you can pretty much follow along, and there's witches and stuff. It doesn't follow the story very closely. I think it replaces Juno with sort of 3 scheming witches, but it's still a great opera, and Dido's Lament is like a classic of the canon for a reason. But that's a whole thing. Anyways, so Dido confronts Aeneas. She is freaking angry, and Aeneas sort of he puts up a wall. He basically just kind of says, you know, I thank you for your kindness, but the gods have told me that I have to leave and I can't go against them. So there's nothing I can do. I'm sorry, I have to leave. And so he heads to his boats. And Dido kind of loses it at this point. She is so emotionally devastated that she's gone at this point. She reminds me a lot of Medea, and so, you know, anytime anyone sees Dido as sort of this fainting violet kind of character who's just sort of like, I love him so much and he left and I'm sad, that's not Dido. She is vengeful and angry and fiery, and her speeches are amazing. But so what she does, she sets up a sacrificial pyre and basically sets up sort of a ritual of sorts, this sort of curse that she's going to place, where she curses the Carthaginians and the Trojans to sort of never be at peace ever, and she stabs herself with a Trojan sword. She doesn't quite die. Her sister, who was there, sort of helped her build this massive pyre, and she thought they were going to be sacrificing animals sort of to beseech the gods to take revenge on the Trojans, but she doesn't realize that Dido herself was the sacrifice, and so she kills herself, and Anna, her sister, sort of brings her up to the pyre to put her on the fire, and I think Anna intends to immolate herself along with her sister because she's pretty devastated at the death of her sister. And at the last minute, Dido is like dying and suffering and struggling, and Juno sort of takes pity on Dido and sort of ends her life just like that and sends her soul to Proserpina in Hades. Proserpina is the sort of Roman equivalent of Persephone. It's just one of the most emotionally devastating and dramatic scenes, and also because, like, as Aeneas' ships are leaving the harbor, because he's like frantic to leave, like he's really shaken, and so he's chopping at the ropes to escape, and they're flying away, but as they're driving away in their ships, he can see the pyre up on a hill, and sort of, he doesn't know exactly what's going on up there, but he has this sinking feeling that something terrible is happening. And it's so good. Like, this is just opera levels of drama, which is why Henry Purcell, of course, turned it into an opera. But it's just devastating, and the emotions really feel genuine. I think when you read something like the Iliad, the emotional moments in that feel like they're melodramatic, but they feel a little like we can't really relate. I think when Achilles gets angry at the death of Patroclus, that's something we can sort of relate to with the sort of untimely death of someone we love. But the emotional landscape of that poem is a little obscure to us. Like, we don't really understand why Achilles would be so incensed at Agamemnon taking his war bride, you know, and the slight against him, because we're not as familiar with the cultural aspects of it. But with this is your classic, you know, love betrayed and finding a loved one who's just broken and damaged, and seeing them commit suicide and then having to deal with that. Like, just all of the emotions in this section are so raw and visceral, and it's just phenomenal. The Shaddy Barch translation, which is the one that I'm reading now, does such a good job with this part. Like, it's just, you imagine like music playing and the camera angles, like it's so cinematic. It's just fantastic. I really like Robert Fagel's version as well. His version is a little more old-fashioned, not too old-fashioned, like it's still readable and everything, but it's still a little more elevated, and not quite as visceral as the other one, but both translations do a really good job. So any version of this that you read, it's so good. So, but what's the point of all of this? Because it's really kind of the emotional crux of the whole poem, but it doesn't seem to affect anything. It's a sort of a thing. Aeneas shows up, this tragedy happens, and then he leaves, and then it's like, okay, now the story can start. So what's actually happening here? So the first off, I think this is and this isn't an original thought, there's lots of other people who think this, but I think this is sort of a allusion to Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra the Seventh. So before Caesar Augustus rose to power, he defeated Cleopatra's forces at the Battle of Actium. And at that point, Marcus Antonius, also known as Mark Antony in English, was having an affair with Cleopatra. And this is Cleopatra the Seventh. There was other Cleopatras before that, but this is the seventh, the famous one. He was having an affair with her, and he was still married to someone in Rome who was like his fourth wife. Mark Antony was a disaster, but this is his fourth wife in Rome, and he was cheating on her with Cleopatra, and they had like 3 kids together. So if you think about like how long it takes for like babies to be born, like they were together for a long time. That's a pretty established affair. And he was so disliked by the Roman people that Augustus sort of struck Mark Antony from the historical record. Now, obviously, we still know about him because he was such an influential figure that all the kind of historians after that sort of know about it. And they're like, we're going to keep writing about this. But at the time, Caesar Augustus wanted, he didn't want anyone to talk about Mark Antony at all. And so when he returned in triumph from Actium, he just said that he defeated kind of Cleopatra's forces, and that was it. But like Mark Antony was seen as a very selfish, decadent person who sort of gave up his duty to the Roman people, because he was one of the triumvirs at one point. It was him and Octavian and Lepidus, and he was one of the triumvirs of Rome, one of the rulers, but he sort of moved to Egypt. At first, it was just sort of to consolidate power, but he ended up staying there and had this long, very public affair with Cleopatra, and who also had an affair with Julius Caesar before him. And he was seen as sort of neglecting his duties and being seduced by sort of this foreign queen, and he was not well liked at all. Mark Antony eventually committed suicide at the Battle of Actium when it was very clear he was very, very defeated. And then Cleopatra, of course, famously probably committed suicide after. Although there's sort of different versions of what actually happened. But there's the Shakespeare version where she had like the snake and, the asp, and she let it bite her, and she, that's how she died. And I don't think that's a Shakespeare invention. I think that's also just sort of the mythology that built up around the event. And Shakespeare, of course, used it because he was like, this is great. So anyways, the idea of sort of a upstanding Roman citizen who neglects his duties in favor of a decadent, self-serving, selfish affair with a foreign queen was very much in everyone's minds. And of course, with Caesar Augustus in power when the Aeneid was written, Virgil needed to sort of use that to his advantage. And so in here, he has Aeneas and Dido. Dido is sort of the Cleopatra figure, the foreign queen. She's beautiful. She has a lot to offer. And if Aeneas had stayed with her, he probably could have become quite powerful and influential in Carthage. But instead, Aeneas, when he's reminded by the gods of his duty to Rome, he leaves her. And even though it's devastating and it's a hard decision for him to make, he does it. And then she, of course, kills herself and curses him with her last breath, and it's really, really devastating. But it's very much like Aeneas is sort of like, I'm not Mark Antony, even though at this point, Mark Antony won't exist for another centuries. But this is a poem that's very much concerned with the present. So it was written during Caesar Augustus's reign, and there's tons of allusions to things happening at that time, even though it's set in kind of the ancient past. And so the purpose of this, on one hand, is to show that Aeneas is a good Roman. I know, he's a cat. Aeneas is a good Roman, and he does his duty over sort of his romantic entanglements. So it shows that he's a better person than Mark Antony. The second purpose of this is to sort of legitimize the Punic Wars, which is kind of a series of brutal battles that Rome had with Carthage. They were enemies for a very long time. And you've probably heard of like Hannibal coming over the Alps with the elephants. That's part of the Punic Wars. There was quite a few. I think there's like three sort of Punic Wars. The middle one is not really a war, but it's a war. And so this was sort of sent, so we have Dido cursing the Trojans and saying that Carthage and Troy will never never be at peace. And so that it's kind of like a prequel thing whenever you have like the Star Wars prequels, setting things up for kind of the evil empire later and the conflict there. It's sort of, they're laying the groundwork. And so this is the prequel explanation for why the Punic Wars happened. And it wasn't because Rome was being too aggressive or expansionist or anything. It's because Dido cursed them, and it was a terrible situation, and the Punic Wars were basically like something they just couldn't escape. It was sort of destined to happen. Plus, the Punic Wars were a place where Rome sort of established its credentials. They had other conflicts sort of before and after, but that was sort of one where they were matched, because Rome was small enough at that point that Rome and Carthage were sort of matched in prowess, basically. And so it was sort of when they proved themselves as sort of a martial power. So the Punic Wars kind of took on a mythical quality in like Roman history. Kind of like how the United States sort of looks at World War I as sort of the war that turned the US into a superpower that was sort of influential on a grand stage. So something like that. But okay, before we get to the end of this, I do also want to do another quick section about the journey to Hades in book 6. That's kind of the end of this section, because it is a very, very important section. There's other stuff that happens, and I'm skipping over a lot, but I don't have enough time to go over everything in minute detail. But the events of book 6 are very important, so we have to talk about them. So this is where they reach Italy, and they descend into the underworld via Avernus, which is a volcanic crater in Italy. It actually exists. Avernus is a real place. It's called something different now, but it was called Avernus then. And it's by Naples. And it's like a volcanic crater, and there's a lake in it. And the name Avernus just means like no birds. Like there's no birds. And I know in the Divine Comedy later, Avernus is sort of the entrance to hell. And then in like Dungeons and Dragons, Avernus is sort of the first layer of hell. So it's gone into the pop culture, but like it's a real place. You can go there in Italy. You just go to Naples and then go over there, and you can be like, hey, I want to go to the underworld. So many heroes in Greek mythology beforehand have journeyed into the underworld, notably like Hercules, or Heracles as he was known in Greece, and Orpheus. And so this is kind of a time-honored tradition. If you have like a great hero, he has to travel into the underworld. And it makes sense that Virgil would have Aeneas kind of make a similar sort of journey. This one is much more detailed than the underworld visit that Odysseus has. In the Odyssey, Odysseus just kind of comes up to like an entrance to the underworld and sort of lays out an offering, and the spirits kind of gather. And so they come up and they kind of line up, and he's able to talk to the spirits of the underworld. But he doesn't actually go into the underworld like Orpheus did when he was going for Eurydice. And so in this one, we get like a full tour of Hades and everything. And it's so cool. Honestly, this is one of the best parts of the story, because it's like a detailed description of like the layers of hell and the rivers and the different monsters that live there, and the castles and like the volcanic castles and stuff. It's great. Now, obviously, this section is a very big inspiration for Dante, like a millennia later, when he's writing the Divine Comedy, because he has Virgil guide Dante through the layers of hell. And it's much more detailed in the Divine Comedy in the Inferno section, but this sort of feels like a predecessor. It's kind of like an early version of that kind of story, because you get this sort of voyage through hell, and you get to see the different people that are there and the different things that they're being punished for. And it was very much, obviously, inspiration for Dante later. Okay, this is another sidebar, but I have to talk about this because this is something that I love a lot, and so I have to talk about it. So the underworld, to the Greeks, was called Hades. And I know we think of Hades as the name of the ruler of the underworld, and that's kind of what he was early on. So if you look at Hesiod, he refers to the ruler of the underworld as Hades. But Hades' name was sort of a he who will not be named kind of thing, and so they didn't use the name a lot. And so over time, the name of the god of the underworld was called Pluton, Plouton. And he was sort of a combination of Hades and another god, Plautus or Plutus, who was sort of the god of wealth. And since like minerals lived under the ground, it was it made sense to combine the two. And so Pluton was sort of the name of the ruler of the underworld to the Greeks. By the time you get to like Aristotle and stuff, that's what they referred to the ruler of the underworld. So that was Persephone's husband, so Persephone and Pluton. And the Roman name of Pluton is Pluto. And so some sources will say that Pluto is the name of the Roman god of the underworld, and that's not correct. That's just the Roman name of the Greek god of the underworld. The Roman god of the underworld, there's a couple, but the main one is sort of Dis-Pater. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but it's basically like Father Death or something, which is a great name. He's also called Rex Infernus, which is like the coolest name ever. So it's basically like king of the Inferno, or the Infernal King. And there's another deity who I think was borrowed from the Etruscans, who was called Orcus. And Orcus was also sort of the ruler of the underworld, or seen as the ruler of the underworld at one point. And so over time, because again, there was no Wikipedia at this point, so there was no like established this is the main version of everything. So there was different pockets of people that worshiped different things. And over time, as the Roman state grew, these different pieces were kind of pulled together and sort of consolidated. And so Orcus and Dis-Pater were sort of combined together at one point, and that was sort of the name of the ruler of the underworld. So the husband of Proserpina, who's the Roman name of Persephone, and that was sort of what his name was. And so in the Aeneid, we see him referred to both as Pluto and as Dis. And I think Orcus is also mentioned as well. So it's very much, these are just different names for the same person. And so it's kind of like, if you think about Satan and Lucifer, those are kind of, it's the same thing, but the names come from different sources, and they were sort of combined together to form sort of one image of sort of the Christian devil. And so when you're looking at sort of Roman mythology and the god of the underworld, he's going to be referred to by a bunch of different names. So, he could be called Hades, Orcus, Pluton, Pluto, Dis-Pater, Rex Infernus. These are all sort of acceptable names. The Romans would have preferred the Roman name, so they would call him Pluto, Dis-Pater, sometimes Orcus, but Dis and Pluto were kind of the most common ones. And then the Greeks would have called him either Hades or Pluton, depending on, what era it was in. Because, and so over time, Hades came to refer to the underworld itself, not its ruler. So, it's a fun thing. And I think also in Roman poetry, you also see the underworld being referred to as Dis. I think in the Divine Comedy even, he refers to like Dis as like a city in the underworld. So it's a whole thing. So it's confusing, but everyone does it, and there's lots of different names for lots of different rulers of the underworld, because I don't know, they're a very captivating type of figure, I think, in mythology and pop culture. And so anyways, so lots of different names for that. So anyways, okay, moving on. So the voyage to the underworld is kind of the crux of the whole poem, because this is where Aeneas is given a vision of the future of Rome via the seer, Sibyl, who sort of tells him sort of the events that will lead to Rome being great. And it talks about Julius Caesar, it talks about Caesar Augustus. He gets a flash forward to the future, because remember, unlike Greek mythology, which sort of arose organically out of many different traditions and different stories that were kind of passed around, the Aeneid is an attempt to sort of create mythology, or to create legitimacy by establishing a backstory. And so in this, it's telling sort of the true story of Aeneas, but in so doing, it's also saying that the rule of Caesar Augustus in our time was preordained, and it's important, and it's sort of what will make Rome great, in the long run. And so that's what he's fighting for. Now, after this section, he meets a couple other people. He also runs into the ghost of Dido, and it's not great. It's very awkward, because she won't even speak to him. She's just going to be mad at him forever, and he's kind of devastated by it. But, it's there. But anyways, when they're leaving the underworld, he's got the ghost of his father and Sybil, and they lead him out, and there's two exits to the underworld. There's the Gate of Horn and the Gate of Ivory. The Gate of Horn is sort of for truth and true spirits to kind of pass through, and the Gate of Ivory is for lies and falsehoods and dreams. And so that's for, like, you know, a way for spirits to send lies and dreams to people in the real world. And Aeneas is asked to leave through the Gate of Ivory. And this is kind of an odd thing, because you think, you know, Aeneas is a person, he's not a spirit. Why wouldn't he leave by the Gate of Horn, which is where kind of truth and everything passes through? And there's a couple different theories. One that I really like is that Aeneas has knowledge of the future at this point, and by passing through the Gate of Ivory, it allows the things that he's learned about in the underworld to sort of take on the quality of a dream. So it's not quite a hard and fast memory that he's going to be like, yes, I learned about the future, and there's going to be this guy named Caesar Augustus who's going to rule this city named Rome, and it's going to be really important. By passing through the Gate of Ivory, the things that he learns about sort of become a bit muddled and get relegated to sort of the part of your mind that remembers your dreams. And so it's not memories necessarily, but it's, you know, he still kind of knows it on a subconscious level, but it's not something he knows, you know, it's like he kind of forgets it a little bit, sort of. And that's a way for him to sort of continue on with the knowledge of his short-term goal without being distracted about sort of the long-term future effects of what he's doing. So he can stay focused on kind of the short-term prize, which is establishing a settlement in Italy. So that's the first half of the Aeneid. There's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. There's a lot of people that he meets in the underworld. There's a whole lot of things that he faces while voyaging from Troy to Carthage, and then from Carthage to Italy. There's a lot of extra stuff there, but overall, those are kind of the most important things to talk about. But please read this poem. I know people don't think about it a lot. It's not as popular as the Odyssey and the Iliad, but it's a really rip-roaring tale. It's a great epic poem. And even though it is in service of establishing sort of the legitimacy of Caesar Augustus, who wasn't a sparkly, clean, perfect ruler, he was quite underhanded, but he kind of had people believing that he was sort of a good and just ruler. And he ruled for quite a long time. He lived until he was like in his 70s. And so it was a way to establish that Caesar Augustus was sort of destined to rule Rome, and he was destined to be where he was, even though he was responsible for sort of making sure that the Republic would sort of never be able to come back for a very, very long time, because he was basically a dictator, even though he never would say that. He took on the title of Princeps. He didn't really like to be called Caesar. He just was called Princeps. And then, you know, over time that led to things getting worse and worse and worse and worse, because it was hard to find good absolute rulers of Rome. But the Aeneid was set to sort of legitimize his rule, but in so doing, I think Virgil was able to talk about the way that truth is subjective, and the way that you have to sort of manipulate people to remain in power, and the way that people are flawed and human. And I think there's still a lot of value to be found in this poem. And so it's not just simple propaganda, it's a genuinely impressive work of Latin poetry in itself. So please read it. I'd love to talk to more people about it. Next week I'm going to be doing my June wrap-up, but then the week after that we're going to be finishing the Aeneid with the war with the Latins. So I will see you then. So with that said, I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye!